Okay, good morning again. I'm going to chair the first session this morning, and the first speaker is going to be Dr. Adrián Velázquez Campoy from the University of Zaragoza. Just as a short bibliography, Dr. Velázquez obtained the PhD in Applied Physics at the University of Granada in 1998. After that, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Johns Hopkins University in the States, and in 2004, he incorporated the University of Zaragoza as Ramón and Cajal researcher, and since 2009, he's an extraordinary collaborator professor at the University of Zaragoza. He's member of the Biocomputing and Physics of Complex System Research Institute, and he's involved in the protein folding and stability research unit. So, Adrián.
Good morning. First of all, I want to thank the organizer for organizing the meeting, the workshop. I want to thank the organizer also for inviting me to be here today. And of course, I want to thank you for attending the meeting and also the attendees that are over the internet. Well, when I was notified about the participation in the meeting, I didn't know what to talk today. But since ITC is a technique that is increasing users year to year, it's a very simple technique, but it's not so simple to do a titration properly. And there are some principles and facts and warnings and some recommendations that I think are useful to be reminded from time to time. So this is the title of my talk. I'm a researcher from the BIFI Institute. The BIFI Institute is a research institute at the University of Zaragoza. We are committed to do research and development, but also technology transfer and teaching. There are different areas at the institute. There are people working in biology, physics, and computation. And of course, there are people working in the binding of two areas. There are people working in biological physics and computational physics and so on. These are the main research lines at the biophysics and biochemistry sections. There are biochemists, chemists, engineers, physicists, etc., working in different lines. I am responsible for the biomolecular interactions line. And in this research line, we are interested in stability and folding of proteins, interaction with biomolecules, conformational changes in proteins upon binding. We have to consider that a protein to function has to undergo conformational changes and has to interact with some other entities. We're interested in cooperative phenomena, in binding, in stability, and we're interested in function of proteins. And we want to apply this knowledge to the drug discovery field, to protein regulation of function and expression, to redesign of protein function, and many other problems that the industry and the society is demanding. Well, ITC has become the gold standard for characterizing intermolecular interactions. It's a simple technique. You have to consider that titration you do in the first course of chemistry, a redox titration or an acid-base titration, is just the same principle applied to the calorimeter. The calorimeter is a more sophisticated because there is an isothermal environment, there is a computer control injector, there are many things, but in essence, it's a regular titration. It's a widespread technique in many labs. It's used as a main technique or a secondary technique to prove or to get additional pieces of evidence, and provides invaluable information about intermolecular interactions, biological and non-biological interactions. But at the same time, as I said, it's very easy to make mistakes and to do it the things improperly, or there is room for improvement at least. And I'm going to present. I'm going to give some recommendation. Of course, I'm not in some of the sentences you will hear. Probably I'm not. I can be corrected. I'm not in. I don't own the truth, but I also want you to interrupt me if you want to, or at the end to ask anything or correct me if I'm wrong, at least in some part. I want to talk about experimental setup, data analysis, and also on the information available by ITC. So there are different levels of information that can be accessed by ITC. The first answer you get is there any interaction between reactant A and reactant B? Yes or no. Some people are interested in that, just in the first screening of for a protein target, or you want to get more information about the strength of the interaction, then you want to determine the equilibrium constant, association or dissociation, and give energy of interaction. Then you can get access to the enthalpy and entropy of interaction. Then you can get also information about the stoichiometry of the interaction, and adding more layers of assays, you can get information about the heat capacity of interaction and the additional partners that are involved in the interaction, like protonation, deprotonation, or another ligand that is allosterically interacting with the main ligand, so on. Here in Spain, we know quite a bit about black legend, and ITC has its own black legend also. People have been blaming ITC for being a technique prone to artifact, and it's true because we are measuring heat, and everything produces heat. It's an advantage and a disadvantage at the same time, so we don't need any fluorophore or chromophore. We don't have to label proteins, or we have to label small molecules. But at the same time, everything will contribute to the global heat we are measuring, and we have to be able to dissect which is the contribution from the interaction, which is the contribution from another processes. People say it's a difficult technique. It's not difficult to make a titration, but it's, as I said, it's not so simple to do a proper titration, and it's not so simple to analyze it properly. It's time-consuming, but you have to bear in mind that nowadays a titration may take half an hour in current instruments. If you compare to another techniques, it's not so time-consuming. Also sample-consuming, but nowadays you can do a titration with less than half a milligram of protein, even less. People also say that it's inadequate for extreme affinity, very low affinity, or very high affinity, but there are ways to overcome this difficulty. And also, there is no kinetic information from ITC experiment, but here in this room there are many people more skilled than me that they know how to extract kinetic information from ITC experiment. Well, I will start with experimental setup. One sentence I hear very often is that there are some very bad buffers for calorimetry. Well, people know about good buffers. The good buffers were discussed by a researcher with I think the surname was Good. So these were trees, mesh, MOX. They were very they were appropriate for biological interactions. And the sentence there are no bad buffers is that you can choose whatever buffer you want. Then you have to do whatever it needs to do. So you can use trees. People say trees is a bad buffer because it has a high ionization enthalpy, but you can do a titration in trees. If you're interested in just to check if there is an interaction, it's okay. If you're interested in the affinity, it's okay. If you're interested in the enthalpy, probably you need to do another test with another buffer just to remove the influence of the buffer, or the potential influence not always there is an influence of the buffer. So you can choose whatever buffer you want. There are no good or bad buffers for calorimetry. You have to take care of the presence of another of co-solvents. So you want to study the interaction between a protein and a ligand, but you have ions, sodium chloride ions. Or you have DMSO because your compound is very hydrophobic, and to increase the solubility, you have to add some DMSO percentage in your solution. Or your protein is prone to aggregation and precipitation, and you have to include 5%, 10%, even 25% glycerol percentage. So in that case, you have to be careful to match all this concentration in the protein solution, in the titration, in the syringe solution, to avoid what I said before, these artifacts coming from other processes different from the interaction. At the same time, you can get additional information on interaction about the role or the influence of these other co-solutes or ions or another ligands coupled to the main interaction, or even the role of water, that in many cases water is released from the binding interface, or water is even sequestered at the binding interface. People have to choose what experimental conditions are going to be implemented. And one of the main criteria is you have to do in physiological conditions. And I always wonder, what are physiological conditions? If you're going to study a cytosolic protein, why are you adding sodium? What is the pH at the physiological condition? If you are going to study a plasma protein, are you going to add 40 milligrams per milliliter of albumin? So this kind of question have to arise when you want to plan your experiment. At the end, you have to plan your experiment according not to physiological conditions, but what are the conditions best suited for your protein or your ligand. So you have to consider thermodynamic stability, kinetic stability of your protein or your ligand, aggregation or precipitation tendency of your protein and your ligand. And at the end, you have to ask, well, can we get close to physiological conditions, or can we then extrapolate later to what could be occurring at physiological conditions? But physiological condition shouldn't be the main criterion to guide your experiment. Another key point is the so-called C-value. It's a very famous parameter in ITC, and it should not be so important. I mean, it's not a goal, it just something we have to deal with, and sometimes we are lucky enough to be in the experimental window for simultaneous determination of enthalpy and affinity, but sometimes we are not. If we are dealing with natural interaction, many times we are in the millimolar range of the dissociation constant, and we are not in this practical window. Sometimes we are in the drug discovery field, and we have a picomolar inhibitor, so we are in the other part of the range. There are ways to overcome this difficulty, but here I show three different titrations. The one in the middle is the ideal situation, but we are not always in the middle. The one at the right, we can determine the enthalpy, but not accurately the affinity. At least we can do a limit value, a lower limit value, but there are ways to actually determine the intrinsic affinity. The one on the left, in that one it's difficult to get the enthalpy, but the affinity is reasonably determined. And if we know accurately, or fairly accurately, the concentration of the reactants, we can get an accurate value of the enthalpy. Concentration of reactants. As I said, C value is an indication, but the C parameter doesn't have to be the objective of our design of the experiment. ITC is very well suited to discriminate between binding affinities. Here you can see ribonuclease A interacting with 2' CMP with 3' CMP and 5' CMP. Small variations in the ligand, just the position of the OH group, give rise to a dramatic change in affinity. So 5' CMP has an affinity of close to millimolar, whereas 2' CMP has an affinity of micromolar. And we have to choose the right concentration. We cannot lower the concentration too much that the signal is insignificant, negligible, or we cannot increase concentration to the millimolar range just because we want to determine the affinity of 5' CMP to millimolar concentrations. You cannot get probably 5' CMP, or protein will start, not ribonuclease because it's a very well behaved protein, but other proteins may can start aggregating, precipitating, etc. So as a rule of thumb, you have to choose in the 5 micromolar, 20 micromolar, 50 micromolar concentration of protein in the cell, and the ligand in the syringe has to be 10 times, 20 times, even 50 times if the affinity is low in the syringe. I'm always talking about protein in the cell and ligand in the syringe, but this ligand may be another protein, maybe whatever, or we may put a small molecule in the cell and the protein in the syringe. So just by professional deformation, I always talk about protein in the cell and ligand in the syringe, but this can be reversed. And we cannot even, we don't have to be talking about proteins. We can start studying DNA interaction with metal ions or whatever, so no protein, but I will always talk about protein and ligand. We have to select a reasonable number of injections. There are people advocating for titration with 5 injections. They say that is enough. I don't think it's enough, and by many reasons, you should not use large volume of injection. Later I will talk about the volume of injection again, and you will see another reason why the volume of injection shouldn't be very large. It shouldn't be very low also. You shouldn't use 50, 60 injections. People say that in using a large number of injections, you will increase the resolution, you will have more points in the inflection, around the inflection point of the titration, and you will get better determined affinity. But then you will lower the signal, you will have more uncertainty in each hit associated with each peak. So you are gaining something, you are losing something. At the end, there is a compromise between the high number and low number of injections. At the end, 20 injections should be enough. These are 2 titrations, one with 10 injections, another one with 50 injections, and 10 I think is in the limit, 50 is too much. When people talk about direct or reverse titration, actually there should be no difference between direct and reverse titration, because there should be nothing different between putting ligand in the syringe and protein in the cell, and putting the protein in the syringe and ligand in the cell. There's an important distinction. When a protein has more than one binding site, the output of the titration, the direct and the reverse, are different, and the analysis is slightly different, but in the main part is the same, because the binding equations are the same. You just have to be careful when calculating the concentrations. But the binding equations are the same, no matter if you are doing the reverse mode or the direct mode. Here I show some titration corresponding to nucleoplasmin, that is a nuclear chaperone interacting with some histones. In that case, in the upper part, you have H5 histone interacting with nucleoplasmin. To the left, direct titration, protein in the cell. To the right, protein in the syringe. It's a good way to check if your model is right. Well, you can never demonstrate if your model is right. You can demonstrate your model is not good, but not that it's right. But anyway, you can get additional evidence of the probability of goodness of your model, let's say. In that case, nucleoplasmin has 5 subunits. Each subunit is binding at 1 histone, and at the end there is a very dramatic negative cooperativity in the binding of the 5 histones. In this example, there was some controversy about the full stoichiometry of the nucleoplasmin. People were thinking the global stoichiometry was less than 5, but with calorimetry we proved it was 5, and later with SACS and with cryomicroscopy, it was proven that 5 is the right stoichiometry. It's the natural one because it's a pentamer, but not always a pentamer binds 5 ligands. You have to be careful with control experiment, control test. You have to do a blank, what we call blank experiment, diluting the titrant from the syringe. You can also dilute the titrant in the cell, but it's less important because the protein in the cell, the dilution that is undergoes is very, very small. And the heat effect coming from that dilution should be very, very small also. You have to do calibration test. I will talk about calibration in a little bit, probably in the next slide. And you have to do water-water test just to check if your calorimeter is working fine. The same as a calibration test, you can do a water-water injection very easily. Calibration. You can do a chemical calibration or an electrical calibration. Electrical calibration is done with resistor surrounding the cell. It's very easy to do, but I don't think it's the best way to do it. It's very easy, very fast, but the right way to do it is a chemical calibration where you test not only the heat sensor, but also the injector and everything. If you do a chemical calibration with calcium and EDTA, that is one of the standard reactions nowadays, then you can, if you get the proper affinity, proper stoichiometry, and proper enthalpy, then you are confident that your instrument is working appropriately. You can do also sucrose dilution for calibration. You can do inorganic chemical complexation to do also calibration. In the past years, ribonuclease A and 2'-CMP was used as a standard, but nowadays it's very difficult to get 2'-CMP. I don't know why. Sigma stopped providing 2'-CMP. So if you have some 2'-CMP samples, keep them very closely. ITC is a finite difference technique. In the last years, some people started developing models for ITC based on differential equations. I think it's a good thing for academic purposes, but we are not doing a continuous titration. We are not doing a titration that fulfills the requirement or the assumption to be modeled by a differential equation model. And the reason is that we are doing finite incremental addition of the titrant into the cell. According to that equation, we are calculating or we are estimating the heat that is evolved upon each injection as a result of the increment in the concentration of complexes upon each injection. To the left, you can see the cumulative heat, and to the right, the differential heat. It shouldn't be called differential heat because it's not the derivative, but the finite incremental derivative. So each point to the right is the finite increment between each 2 points on the left. And another main point is that if we decrease continuously the injection volume, we are going to have the same output to the right if we normalize by the ligand injected. If we don't normalize, we're going to decrease the signal continuously until we get a zero signal or close to zero signal. So it's not the same doing a titration formally and rigorously. The output signal is not the same in a titration with 50 injections as the titration with 10 injections, as you saw. Okay. When you normalize, you get the same, but you have lower heat, you have higher uncertainties for each peak, and the titration is not formally the same. Binding equations that have to be used for data analysis are universal. The same binding equations have to be used for fluorescence titration, for NMR titration, for calorimetry. The only difference that in calorimetry you introduce the enthalpy, in fluorescence you introduce the emission coefficient, for NMR you use the intrinsic chemical shift, but the same binding equation had to be used in the binding. At the end, the output signal is heat or chemical shift or average chemical shift or fluorescence intensity, whatever. Okay. When you have a one-to-one stoichiometry system, you can use these two equations to calculate the concentration of complex. The first one is very simple. It's a hyperbolic dependency with the free ligand concentration. The second one is a little bit more complex because you don't have the free concentration of ligand, you have the total concentration of ligand. But these two equations are exact and not valid for any binding technique, calorimetry, fluorescence, spectroscopy in general. The main point is that the first one is many times misused because people use that equation not with the free concentration of ligand, but with the total concentration of ligand. This is valid if your concentration of ligand is large compared to the protein, but not always you have that situation, and mainly in the first part of the titration, where you are adding a low concentration of ligand. So I want to stress that both equations are valid, are exact, but you have to manage them. You have to know how to use them. And many people doing fluorescence titration are using the first one, and it looks very simple, then say, well, calorimetry is very difficult because you have to use the second equation. Well, in fluorescence, you should use also the second equation, but sometimes this fact is overlooked, and the reviewers don't oppose to that, and everything is very simple. But binding equations respond to chemical equilibrium and mass conservation and should be the same for any system and for any technique. The standard approach should be based on the partition function or the binding polynomial, no matter the complexity of the system. Fortunately, 95% of the system people are studying are one-to-one stoichiometry, so you don't need a complex model. But in some cases, you have a protein with 5 binding sites with cooperativity, or a protein with 2 ligands that are interacting allosterically, and so on. So you need to select the proper binding model. And all situations, I don't want to say to be so categorical, but most of the situations can be handled with the same formalins based on the binding polynomial. With the binding polynomial, it's just the the first expression you see is the partition function of the system, and it's a n-degree polynomial in the free concentration of ligand. From that binding polynomial, considering the mass conservation equations for protein and ligand and the chemical equilibrium, you can arrive to the left to a polynomial equation in the free ligand or to a set of equations for the free ligand and free protein. And from non-linear square fitting, you can get the interaction parameters, equilibrium constant, and enthalpy. Beta is the overall association constant. And I recommend always, unless you have a one-one stoichiometry, if you have several binding sites, I always recommend using the overall association constant, do the fitting and the analysis with the overall association constants, and depending on the values you get for the association constant, you can decide you have independent and identical binding sites, different binding sites and independent, or identical binding site with cooperativity, or more difficult, different binding sites with cooperativity. But first of all, you have to do a general model analysis with the overall association constant, and then restrict to the appropriate model with site-specific equilibrium constants. Now I go to the sequential binding model. I have discussed this with some people, and I advocate for removing this name, sequential binding model. It's not a specific model. It's just this model, or this the sequential binding model is just the general model expressed in terms of the stepwise association constant. It's not a specific model, and many people are inferring some wrong conclusions based on that expression. So for a protein with two binding sites, the sequential binding model is the expression on the middle. Zeta equal to 1 plus K1L plus K1 K2 L squared. Okay. This is just the general binding model for a protein with two binding sites, written in terms of the stepwise association constant. And we are not assuming nothing about the independency or cooperativity between binding sites. But people say the second term, K1 is the binding to the high affinity site if we have two binding sites with different affinities. K2, the binding to the second site. This is not true. K1 represents the binding of the first ligand to either place, first site or second site. First ligand, not first site. And K2 is the binding of the second ligand, no matter what, high affinity or low affinity. So at the end, sequential binding model would mean the second ligand binds after the first ligand, which is true. And there is no need for a name for that model. Okay? So it's I think there is no need for that name. K1 represents the binding to site 1 and site 2, even if they are identical, even if they are different, or there is a cooperativity or not. And people tend to think that if you have two different affinities, ligand always bind first to the high affinity and then to the second, to the low affinity side. And this is not true. A ligand binds second to the low affinity site only when there is a negative cooperativity. There's no option. You have two identical binding sites with negative cooperativity. The first ligand binds to either one, and the second to a site with lower affinity. But if you have two binding sites with different affinities, the ligand can bind to the high affinity, to the lower affinity, because there is always a non-zero probability, or molar fraction, of the protein with the ligand bound to the lower affinity site. Okay? So, sequential binding model, the name is interpreted in terms of ordered binding, which is not the situation. There is no ordered binding. The only order is that the second ligand binds after the first. That is why its term is called second, because it goes after the first. What is the meaning of case? I already said that people many times misinterpret the meaning of the case. And the cooperativity, many people say, well, K2 is lower than K1, so there is negative cooperativity. Or K2 is higher than K1, so there is positive cooperativity. And that's not true. For a protein with two binding sites, K2 multiplied by 4 is the parameter you have to compare with K1. Okay? So if K2 is 2 times K1, there is no cooperativity. Well, there is cooperativity, actually. There is negative cooperativity. As I said, fortunately, 95% of the situations correspond to the one-to-one stoichiometry, and we don't have to care about additional ligands, what happens with water if it's being displaced from the binding interface, because we can always employ an apparent binding affinity in terms of beta or K, because in a one-to-one stoichiometry, beta is equal to K, it's identical to K. And this model, this simple model, can be applied no matter if you have conformational change coupled to binding, if you have a big conformational change, or a small conformational change, you have allosteric system, or if you have polysteric system. So this model can be applied to any situation if you have a stoichiometry 1-to-1. Calculation of concentration and heat. This is a matter of some technical point. The main point here, I don't want to read the equations, is that if you use low volume of injections, always the different ways to calculate concentrations and heat, the dilution factor is practically the same, are equivalent. So there are people using the expression to the left, there are people using the expression to the right. Actually, the expression to the left corresponds to two different ways of calculating, if you see the lower equation. But all are equivalent, provided that the volume of injection is very small compared to the cell volume. The heat of dilution problem. The heat of dilution is a name for the background heat that is present all along the titration in all the peaks due to non-binding interaction, due to mechanical disturbance due to the injection, or difference in temperature between whatever is injected compared to the temperature of the cell, mechanical and non-mechanical effects not related to the proper binding of the ligand and the protein. People usually estimate the heat of dilution to properly analyze the data, because sometimes you get at the end of the titration very big heat, and for example, microcal equations don't deal with the non-zero heat of dilution, and they have to estimate to remove that contribution. They have to estimate the heat of dilution. People estimate that from control test, diluting the ligand into buffer, but sometimes this is not the proper way to do it, because it's not exactly the same process that is occurring along the titration. People also estimate the heat of dilution from averaging the last peaks in the titration, but as you see here, the average of the last peaks don't give you the proper answer. So at the end, I advise you to include an additional adjustable parameter, free parameter, heat of dilution, to account for non-zero heat of dilution. And I'm going to finish with 2 or 3 slides about information accessible by IDC. So as I said before, IDC is very powerful. You can get the binding affinity, you can get the enthalpy, the entropy, and the partition of the Gibbs energy into enthalpic and entropic contribution is very important to know a little bit more about the interactions underlying the protein ligand interaction. There are many examples where the enthalpy and entropy reflect different intermolecular interactions. Enthalpy reflects mainly hydrogen bond formation and breaking, and electrostatic interactions between the two partners, and entropy reflects mainly hydrophobic desolvation and conformational rigidity of the molecules that are interacting. But also you have to be careful, because when you discuss a given interaction, you don't have to look at the crystal structures only, because any hydrogen bond that is being established between the two binding partners probably is being breaking between each partner and water. So at the end, you have a competitive process between water interacting with the free reactants and the two reactants forming the complex. In that case, you have different, this example is with the HIV protease, the aspartic protease from the immunodeficiency virus, the human immunodeficiency virus, and the plot here to the left at the bottom show the temporal line for designing inhibitors for this protease. At the beginning you have indinavir, ritonavir, nelfinavir, the first generation inhibitors, and you see that all of them have reasonable high affinity in the nanomolar, but most of them they have positive enthalpy. Enthalpy opposes binding. Going to the right, time is going on, and 12 years later, you have inhibitors with higher affinity and with favorable enthalpy and entropy. So of course, the first inhibitors were developed in a hurry, because there was some urgency to get drugs for combating that disease. But the best inhibitors at the end, after 12 years, are the ones with high affinity, but also with positive enthalpy. If at the beginning we can ask if from the beginning people were interested not only in affinity but also in enthalpy, will this stretch of 12 years could be shortened to 5, to 4? Well, we don't know, but we are trying to stress that not only affinity, but also enthalpy and entropy should be of interest for not anybody, but people working in the drug design field and drug discovery. What happens when you don't see a titration? When I mean a titration, it's just a set of peaks that are varying in area or height according to the time. So if you see 20 identical peaks, you tend to conclude that there is no titration. But this is true 90% of the times, and it's not true 10% of the time. Because if the enthalpy of interaction, or the global enthalpy, like I say, is 0 at the conditions, you don't see a titration. You see identical peaks, but there is actual interaction. So even if you do a test and you don't see interaction, you should do another test at different temperature, different pH, different buffer. The quickest thing is to do a titration at a different temperature. If at 2 different temperatures, reasonably different, you see the same output, then you can conclude there is no titration. There is no interaction, sorry. Yes, sir. Well, there are some slides. ¿Queda tiempo o no queda tiempo? Un par de minutos, suficiente. When you want to determine the heat capacity of interaction, you do experiment at different temperatures. And from the slope of the plot, observe enthalpy versus temperature, that slope is the heat capacity of interaction. To the left, you see a system where the enthalpy in open symbols is not following a linear trend. Conclusion: there is a binding partner, either in the syringe or the cell, or both, that are undergoing a conformational change modulated by temperature. So the corollary would be, if you don't see a curved plot, if you see a linear trend, there should be no conformational change. But this corollary is wrong. Sometimes you see a linear trend and there is a conformational change. The point is that on the right, you see the black symbols, there is a linear trend, but this linear trend has a very high slope. This is a HCV protease from the hepatitis C virus binding zinc. It's a very high slope. The heat capacity of the interaction is similar to that of the folding of the protein. So there is a huge conformational change. The point is that the temperature is not modulating, in that case, the conformational change. It's the same conformational change along the temperature interval. So linear plot of enthalpy doesn't mean no conformational change. And finally, with ITC, you can get information about cooperativity, homotropic cooperativity, and heterotropic cooperativity. Homotropic, ligand binding to one site is affected by the occupancy of another binding site by the same ligand. Heterotropy means ligand binding to one site is affected by the binding of another ligand, different ligand, at another site. And with ITC, you can get information about both. And in particular, in heterotropic cooperativity, you can get information about competitiveness of both ligands. If alpha equal to 0, you have competitive ligands. If alpha is equal to 1, you have independent ligands. There is no cooperativity. And if alpha is larger than 1, you have positive, less than 1, lower than 1, negative cooperativity. So you get a lot of information about the system you are trying to study. And with that, I finish. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Adrian. I'm sorry because we have a small delay and we have no time for questions. During the coffee break, we can improve the discussion. And now we are going to the second speaker.